Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 3 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading The Power of Myth, a book about the conversation between the mythologist Joseph Campbell and the journalist Bill Moyers from back in the 80s. We're starting on the second chapter, or the second episode, as it was broadcast on PBS, The Journey Inward. This was an very interesting chapter, very metaphysical, introspective, I think. What were your thoughts overall?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And I think for the one and only time, I didn't really like this chapter.
Really?
Yeah. It's not that I disliked it. It was a little esoteric and
Really?
somewhat out there.
I thought that you were going to dig this one when I was reading it. I thought
Not
you were gonna
quite.
dig it.
Not quite.
Mr. Campbell seems like somebody that, I mentioned Joe Rogan from time to time, and Rogan's a big proponent for LSD and is it DMT? You know, those kind of hallucinogenics to get to your inner spiritual. And I think that Campbell really, really, really believes in that kind of stuff. You kind of have to get to your, your inner soul, and we're all our own divinity is within us, and all that hippie stuff.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely sort of in that vein of things. And he
But
starts
it makes
off...
a lot of good points about myth, themes of mythology about those things. But
Yeah, I mean, it's very well written, of course. It's got some interesting insights, but it's a little wild.
I'll be
Yeah.
darned. I'm kind of surprised.
Yes. Well, he starts out with this discussion about how we're really the same humans as people from, generations ago. He says we have the same bodies, organs, energies as people from 30,000 years ago, and so we all recognize similar images.
And that is forgotten by so many people today. That, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, they're no different than the people of today. Maybe have a little bit more knowledge, but sometimes less.
Yeah.
Because people then had to grow their own food and raise their own, meat and all that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of knowledge that goes into that a lot of people nowadays don't have.
And he says we really address the same problems, but these problems wear different costumes when they appear at different times. And he says that really here it's where we see these mythic images that are carried from generation to generation, and the myths help us read the messages of the world. So he's really kind of saying the reason why we have so many similarities in all these myths, and this is really one of the underlying themes of this whole chapter, he really says it's because it's really biological. Because we are the same people, we have the same, imagination, which stems from our biology. This is really the foundation of these mythic images. That's why they're all similar. It's something innate within our biology here.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to have the belief that he seems to be almost an atheist in a sense, or he's a pantheist, where he thinks all living things have a soul.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't think there's any real... I guess he does think there's a truth, but the truth is so diffused among all of us that there's no absolute truth or rule giver or life giver type of thing.
I think he really kind of gets into his, I don't know if it's theology, but really his philosophy really
Yes.
towards the end here. So we're going to touch on that at the end.
Right.
I'm going to read this section because I thought this is...
What
this is
page are you
cool.
on?
45, page
All right.
45.
Oh, that's early on. I mean, we
Yes.
got 40 pages to go after that.
One thing that comes out in myths, for example, is that at the bottom of the abyss comes the voice of salvation. The black moment is the moment when the real message of transformation is going to come. At the darkest moment comes the light. So this is just one of his examples of, this is one of the themes, and I think that's very true, is that we as humans, we like stories in which, it seems to go bad, and then there's this resurrection or this, comeback story, and we definitely do like those, but I do think that's true just in how we live our lives as well. I think sometimes we do have to get to our lowest points in order to get back to where we need to be. You seem confused.
No, I think that's a theme. We did our last chapter on various mythologies, and I think it's just a theme of all good storytelling too. A lot of sayings, darkest before the dawn and all that kind of stuff. But
Yes.
good explanation. But
Thank you. The next section is really kind of where he gets a little bit esoteric, and this is where he talks about dreams for quite a while. He says that dreams reveal our spiritual information. They reflect our worries and desires. And that dreams are based on a body of experiences that have some kind of significance in our lives. So really when we dream about things, it's really just a very Freudian look at dreams here, that our dreams kind of reveal our...
I don't know. You think it's Freudian or Jungian?
Well, I mean, They're both pretty similar.
Yeah, but I think I thought he was making a point that he disagreed with Freud, because Freud had a view that your dreams are your own personal story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what he's saying is that, I think that he's saying that there's general themes that
yeah, I think he's
further than what your own personal story.
I think
is.
he's kind of combining them in that our personal story is oftentimes the same as the social story. So while it is our own personal worries, they just happen to coincide, with the worries and the desires of the people around us.
Yeah, well, he's talking about the archetypes,
Yeah.
which I think is more, I'm not an expert on these, but more Jungian.
Yeah.
From Jung.
Yes, Jung. Yeah, he was Swiss. Who knows how to pronounce his name?
Well, I suppose the Swiss do.
Maybe. That's a good point. But yeah, he really goes into this, and that dreams are kind of this
like a window into the soul,
Yes, window into
inner
the soul.
being, and truth, and all that stuff, and kind of a similar attitude about LSD or psychedelics that get past the current conscious reality to go into a dream state and get higher meaning and stuff. And I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I buy more into the dream side of it. Now, I will say this. I think you can, if you pay attention to your dreams, you can learn a lot about yourself and about your really what you're worrying about and your challenges. And whenever I started a new job, I haven't started a new job in a long time, but I would always dream. When I like the third day in, I would wake up in the middle of the night and I'd be dreaming of the different job duties. It's like my brain was working on getting all that worked out and how to do different things, practical things. And of course, then you like the cash register naked or whatever.
Yeah, I definitely agree with him. That it is true that dreams aren't just random. I think they are definitely based on our life experiences and what we want and what we're afraid of and that sort of thing. So there's definitely some truth there, and that we can find some sort of message in our dreams. I don't know if I go as far as him. He goes on to say, I'm going to read a little bit from the book again, what is a myth and what is a dream? He says, a dream is a personal experience of that deep, dark ground that is the support of our conscious lives, and a myth is the society's dream. The myth is the public dream, and the dream is the private myth. If your private myth, your dream, happens to coincide with that of the society, you are in good accord with your group. If it isn't, you've got an adventure in the dark forest ahead of you. So what he's really kind of saying there is that what a myth is, it's a shared, collection of the values and the fears and the desires of these people. And so in a way, the personal fears and the personal desires are our dreams, but then the public fears, the public desires of the whole group, that is the myth, that is the dream of the whole people, essentially.
Yeah. It's more like the common themes of everybody's dreams in that society. And you kind of, meld them all together for the main themes, main storylines, and the same types of stories, but applying them individually.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with that.
I don't disagree either. And I kind of do agree also with what he says, kind of at the end of that quote, what I was just saying. He goes on to say, that's what real leaders are. Leaders are the ones who have dreams that are different from the dream of the society, and that you have to have some sort of break from the myth, from the overall desires and the fears of the society as a whole to lead the society in a new and maybe better direction. That's what he says. What a real leader is someone who has discordant dreams from the rest of society.
I don't know that I don't know if he's saying that generally about leaders. Certainly, if you're going to take society in a different direction, that would be true. But I think you could lead people in the same direction.
I guess that's true.
Don't you think?
I guess that's true.
I don't know that I think he's saying he's talking about people that don't quite fit in with society and culture, and he's asserting that they dream differently. They have different non-standard visions and kind of really values is really what it comes down to it. And then those are the types of people that steer culture into a different direction than it was before, which I think is generally true. But I don't know if it has anything to do with dreams.
Yeah,
I think it has to do with them having a different perspective.
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily because they dream differently. They might dream differently just because they have a different perspective.
I don't know that they do.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be a very hard thing to study.
How would you? I guess if you.
You are challenging society. Tell me about your dreams.
Right.
Like, yeah.
Right.
It's
And you'd have to be successfully challenging society, leading it into a different direction.
Yeah.
So it's a theory.
Yeah.
It sounds like some of my pet theories, where it's
Yes.
completely unprovable one way or the other.
Sounds like you. Absolutely.
Yes.
And then he goes on to kind of like prove this idea, or he tries to prove this idea in like, why there are so many, common themes. And he does this by comparing Genesis to these other texts from all around the world. Bill Moyers reads out a quote from Genesis in the Bible, and then Campbell responds by reading a very similar quote. He picks up the Pima Indians of Arizona, the Hindu Upanishads, the Basari people of West Africa. So it's definitely a variety of different things. And I think, there is a lot of truth there, and that these are very similar passages here.
Especially the Old Testament creation stories. We've seen that, we've mentioned that in last season so many times. Out of nothingness came, creation from the creator God or whatever it is.
And I guess
out of chaos, order, that type of thing.
The question there for, I guess, us particularly, we're Catholics, what does that say about like the truth or the uniqueness of the Bible? Why is that singularly true and the others are false if they're so similar?
Well, I don't. I see a lot of the Old Testament stuff as a type of myth. I think it's instructive, and so I don't view that as that God actually did in 7 days. I mean, I don't.
Well, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I'm supposed to, but I see that there are truths within there that are. I'm not going to dispute, and so this doesn't cause me any heartburn with regard to that. Now he's a little, I guess you would say, blasphemous when it comes to Christianity. It gets into the resurrection a little bit later, but I mean I don't mean that he doesn't have to be of the faith. I was kind of overstating the blasphemous part of it, but I think he's makes some very good comments about creation stories and how they're very similar over cultures and over different societies. And his idea is that it's a human-made concept, and so there's certain universal truths because we're all humans. We all have the same organs. We've been like this for thousands of years. Yes, or it could be there's an inherent underlying truth.
Yeah,
to that God created it. So he's discounting the opposite possibility, which is there was a creator and it created everything out of nothing, and it went from there.
Yeah, because that's, I guess, my theory about things. Why there are so many similarities is that I think we're all trying to find that truth, and I think there are ways, there are avenues to find that truth in this world, in that people have just done it either more successfully or less successfully than others. And of course, with things like this, these very philosophical and theological things, it's very easy to take a small detail and go a complete opposite direction.
Right.
While still, being very similar. And that's kind of my opinion on why there's so many different religions and so many different mythologies, perhaps, is because we all are trying to find the same truth. It's just we found very different avenues, but there is one objective truth.
Yeah.
Good insight. Thank you.
I mean, I had a long monologue, and
did.
then you had a response, and then I don't think I need to keep going back and forth. You're acting like I have to keep responding to you.
I'm so sorry.
Sometimes I don't have much to say in response. You made a good point.
Well, that's not true. You always have much to say.
Well, I can make up something. Which, by the way, are we going to get? We're right onto the time subject, aren't we? Are we going to move into that?
Not quite. I wanted to touch on where he talks about the symbolism of the serpent, because I thought this was really interesting.
Yeah.
Where he says, again, talking about Genesis and the serpent in the garden tempting Adam and Eve. He kind of goes on to say, why do we have that symbol of the serpent? And he says, usually in most cultures, the serpent is a symbol of life. And that, sheikhs shed their skin to be born again. It's a symbol of life, immortal energy, and consciousness, engaged in the field of time, constantly throwing off death and being born again. And the snake is also essentially a traveling canal, really only eating other beings, which life depends on. So it's two sort of images there, the shedding of the skin, which points to life, and the snake essentially just being one long stomach tract. That is also symbolism of life and eating.
I think you might be overthinking it a little bit. I mean,
maybe.
Snakes are just kind of icky. I mean, they don't have any legs.
Yeah, well, what he's saying is usually in cultures, they're not icky. They're put in a good position. He says, but in Christianity, the serpent and the woman, which is another symbol of life, are associated with bringing sin into the world and thus associating life with sin. And I think that is true. in a way. I mean, I think it's a neat comparison to draw, and that, that is maybe the metaphor that is there in Genesis. And
I don't get. I never got why people always asserted that the serpent and or the woman caused sin to come into the world, because all three of them are equally guilty.
Yeah.
Because, I guess you'd say, well, the serpent put the idea in their head. But, that doesn't cause you to have sin. That really gives you free will.
Yeah.
Well, I guess choice. And just because she says, hey, we should eat this fruit, he should have said, no. That's called the forbidden fruit because it's the forbidden fruit.
Yes.
Didn't you just hear him say, no, you're not supposed to eat that? But what does he do? Oh, okay. And it's the woman's fault? What the hell is that? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. It never made any sense to me. Like, you read about, well, the women cause sin. No. I mean,
I agree. I think what he's saying,
his mischaracterization is the same as all these other people are mischaracterizing and saying, well, this story says that women are at fault. No, it doesn't.
Well, I think what he's really saying is it's really not about a woman at all. I think what he's saying is, man is representative of all of humanity. Woman is representative of life. The serpent is representative of life. And so with life comes sin to humanity. That is a necessary product of being alive.
I think that's horseshit.
Really?
I don't think that they are in that story the source of life in that story.
Well, I don't think they're the source of life. They're just representative of life.
Why are they representative of life and the dude isn't?
Because that's just a common metaphor. That's what he's saying. It's a common mythic image.
I know what he's saying, but he's just asserting it. I'm not convinced that he is correct, that those are the...
Well, because he's pulling on all of these different cultures, because he's, a comparative mythologist, and what they do is they look at, well, what are all the similarities here? Okay, woman is seen as an example of life in all of these different cultures. A serpent is seen as an image of life in all these different cultures. Man isn't necessarily seen as an image of life in all these cultures. Man is usually representative of people. And so what he's kind of positing here is that we are taking those same mythic images, and they have that same... metaphor behind them, and it's just being used in Genesis in this way to represent life and sin coming to man.
I understand what he's saying.
Okay.
But I don't see this as a story of life giving.
Okay.
I see it as a story of choosing and free will.
Yes.
Now, he views that as a form of life-giving. I don't. I see that as going from an innocent state of nature, life, to a less than innocent state of nature, which means you're making moral decisions. Like for instance, our cute little dog Violet. We joke that she murdered a little baby rabbit, but I don't think she really intended to hurt the rabbit.
Yes.
It was running, and she grabbed it and accidentally killed it. I don't think there's any moral statement to be made about that, other than we got to make sure she doesn't kill any other little baby rabbits.
Yes.
But I don't know if that's even moral. It's just it's unnecessary. And so I think the story of Adam and Eve and the apple and all that stuff is about free will and about sin. And so in essence, the serpent suggests the choice as a bad choice. But it wasn't necessarily an immoral thing to do to eat the apple, because it was just prohibited.
Yeah,
He didn't hurt anybody by eating an apple, other than potentially themselves. Although they gained the knowledge, I see it more as an explanation of how the original sin and how we now have responsibility for what we choose.
I see. Why is your assertion correct and his isn't?
I just explained it.
Okay, well, I just explained his using much the same way.
Except for that there's no part of that story that has anything to do with life.
I mean, it is the creation story.
They've already been created.
Well, he's not... It doesn't have to... That's what he's saying. It doesn't have to literally be about life to be about life. Like, you do not have to say, the serpent and the woman gave the man life. You say, it's a metaphor.
The man already had life. There's nothing life-giving in this story. The life has already been given.
But that's not what he's saying. He's not saying in this one story, the serpent and the woman are giving life. He's saying in all of these other cultures...
They're symbols of life.
Yes,
I get
that's what I'm saying.
But it has nothing to do with it.
Why does that... What do you mean?
I just explained it. Are you not listening to me?
But just because they don't literally, the story is not literally about him getting life. It's a metaphor. Do you not know how metaphors work?
Yeah, it's not a metaphor about life giving.
Why not?
Just because not all stories about women are stories about life. Not all
I
stories
understand.
about serpents are stories about life. He's trying to force that analogy into the story. That's what I'm saying. And yes, I am asserting it.
Okay.
I don't know for sure 100% that I'm right and he's wrong.
Well, you're certainly acting like it.
Well, I'm asserting it.
Yes.
And I believe it.
Okay.
But I don't think I have to apologize for me being right and him being wrong.
Yes.
Well, this is my unlimited opinion
Yes.
show, isn't it?
Well,
It's my
yours. Yours. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I just don't buy his version of this and
Okay.
his analysis of it. And it goes back to kind of a gripe I've had of a lot of people that tell that story and I think analyze it.
I understand.
And I think he's overanalyzing it
Yeah.
in a different, weird, creepy way, actually. Oh, it's about women being symbols of life. Okay, yeah, I know they are. But this isn't a story about having a baby. This isn't a story about anybody being created. This is a story about that sin and right and wrong and people making choices.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. So you didn't really have an issue so much with how he came to that conclusion. You just, well, I mean, you do
Yeah,
have an issue with
I
that.
do
but
have
I
an
think
issue how he came to
Yes.
it and what his conclusion
Okay,
is.
I see.
The
I
whole
see.
thing was wrong.
All right, I see.
From beginning to end. It's very much like, if in his version of this, my disagreement with him, he would be the woman.
What does that mean?
Because his female form created this stupidity that was his analogy to life-giving and the serpent and the skin and all that kind of stuff.
That is lovely. Thank you for that. Yes. We're going to move on to his next point, which I thought was really interesting and I really liked. And this is his idea of the transcendent God. And I think this is what you were talking about time here. He says, God is unnameable. He is transcendent of all names and forms. He goes on to say, the ultimate leave-taking is leaving God for God, foregoing our notion of God for an experience beyond all notions. So he's really saying we cannot put any sort of name on God. We cannot describe God. There's no form that fits God because God is just so beyond everything. And he says, we always think in terms of opposites, but God is beyond opposites. And he goes on to say, always think of good and evil, man and woman, et cetera, et cetera. So much of what we say and what we do is predicated on the fact that, there is something and then there is not something, essentially.
Right.
That is very true for many parts of our lives.
Do you remember, like in our first season, talking about different concepts of proofs of God, and then if I think of there not being a God, then there must be a God because there must be an opposite to it. I forget who that philosopher was that came up with that theory.
Yeah, I forget the name too, but yeah, it's very reminiscent of this.
Yes.
He goes on to say the best things can't be told because they transcend thought. The second best are misunderstood. The third best are what we talk about, and myth is that field of reference to what is absolutely transcendent. So what he's saying is, if we really want to get to God, we have to get beyond, any words, any notions of what we think we know, essentially, just to go beyond anything. And this really goes on into what he talks about a little bit later, and really experiencing God rather than necessarily preaching or teaching and that sort of thing, which I'll get into in a little bit later. But this definitely goes back to, of course, our many episode debate of whether or not God is beyond time.
Yeah. Well, no, we both agreed God was beyond time.
Yes. Whether or not God can see the future and whether or not that makes us have free will or not, essentially. That was our debate.
Well, our debate was whether God is omniscient about the future.
Yes.
And my initial position was no, because it hasn't happened yet. It didn't exist yet.
And you were kind of saying that puts a limit on our free will. If he knows the future.
I don't know that I said that.
Did you not?
I don't think I said that.
I'll go back. I'll look through hours and hours.
No, because what I was saying was that we have free will, and we have not created those choices yet, so they don't even exist for God to know it.
I see.
They didn't exist in the past or the future because they don't exist until the choice is made.
My position was that there is no past or future for God because he is just outside of time entirely. So he does know it, just
Right.
not necessarily as the future, because it's already happened and it hasn't happened because he's beyond time, beyond.
As I'm explaining my old position, I'm starting to convince myself that
Oh
I'm still right.
no! we were just saying last night that you were finally convinced. And I said I wanted to get this on recording.
I didn't say I was convinced. I said I think I'm coming around to the idea that you are right.
You really want to make the
wrong.
distinction that I did not convince you.
Well, I was thinking, I've been thinking about this pretty consistently, almost on a daily basis.
Really?
Those conversations. Yeah, I think about it a lot. And anyway, so should I tell the whole story, or do you just want me to cut to the chase?
You could tell the whole story.
All right. So there was a prayer service, and for a little girl who was injured, anyway, the priest had a homily, a very good homily, very thought provoking. Anyway, they scheduled the prayer service, kind of like what do you call it? Not a service, but a prayer. I guess it is a service where you want to get together and pray for this little kid who's been seriously injured. And one of the parents, he said, well, we're going to have it. Told the parents we're going to have this thing tonight, this prayer session for everybody, the community, get together to pray for your daughter. And one of the parents asked him, well, isn't it going to be too late? What if it's too late? And he relayed that to us and said, what he explained to the parents was, well, God's outside of time. Same kind of discussion we had. But it made a good point, and I thought it was so interesting that it doesn't matter when the prayers are made relative to the events, because God is outside of time, so God will know of the prayers, whether they're at 7:00 p.m. later today, or 2 weeks from now, or last week, and it will act accordingly. Basically, we didn't get to that part of it, but I was just thinking about that, and I've also been struggling with my position as it relates to prophecies, and those types of things within the Bible. And if he's not omniscient about the future, those cannot exist. Yeah. Those cannot be true. And so I've been wrestling with it. So I think you've come around. I've come around to your way of thinking, because I think your argument, and you almost convinced me that. I think it was first season anyway. Yeah. And anyway, so I was thinking about all that, and we mentioned it. We were talking last night. I
was also thinking about that same thing, because the Catholic Church teaches, pray for the dead, and I used to think, what good does that do them? They're already either in hell or in heaven. That makes a lot of sense when you look at it as, God hears those intercessions no matter if the person's already dead or not.
Right.
To him, it's just the intercessions are there or they're not, and that we either did pray or we didn't pray, and so that intervention there to bring that soul to heaven or to hell, I guess that would make a lot of sense in that sort of understanding.
Do you ever tell you the story? My dad had a relative that he said was a very difficult person, and that's to put it lightly. And after that person died, on a very regular basis, I don't know if it was daily, but not daily, but on a regular basis, he would pray for her. What do they call that? For her soul.
The repose of her soul?
Repose. Yeah. Thank you for the word. Repose of her soul. And because he was kind of assuming she probably didn't go, I know I've identified her as a her, but nobody's going to put this together as somebody that died many, many years ago, decades ago. And he'd pray for her because he was concerned about her, because she was a difficult person. And he said every day, when he would pray for her, not long after, some bad thing would happen to him. So he was convinced that he needed to keep praying for her. And I remember talking to him, well, do you think it's her? And he says, I don't know. I don't know if it's somebody that wants to keep her and wants to dissuade me from praying for her. I thought that was just it was a weird conversation.
Yeah.
My dad was kind of a deep guy, but also kind of an odd duck, and that I started thinking of that with when the father was talking about it, because that person had already passed, and I was just always assuming, well, then the person's either got to go where they're going to go, because whatever they did, they did. But if prayers have any meaning, if you're trying to pray for somebody, maybe you can tip the scales. I don't know. And if you can, why couldn't it be after they pass?
Mm-hmm.
Which I never really thought of before.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It's definitely an interesting idea. I like how he puts it here too, kind of being transcendent of all the forms and everything. And then he goes on to go even more in detail about his ideas on metaphors. He basically says all biblical stories are metaphors. That's kind of what he's positing here. And he gives the example of the Garden of Eden. That's just a metaphor for innocence that is innocent of time, and opposites as the prime center out of which consciousness becomes apparent or aware of change. That's what he really says. There was no real garden. This was just a metaphor for things. And I guess he doesn't give too many examples here, but I figure he would say just about the same for everything else in the Bible. Was there a Moses? Was there an Abraham? All these things. And I figure his response would be much the same. No, it's a metaphor for this way of thinking, essentially.
Oh, I don't know. Do you think he would think that? I mean, there are historical figures that I think were documented.
Yes, but I think he would say the events that happened to them did not really happen.
An extent. Not all of them.
Yes.
Yeah, like the big stories, the direct spiritual interventions.
Yes.
And all that stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, I think he probably would. Yeah.
Then he goes on to say that there's really two explanations for why there are so many similarities between myths. And the first is that human psyche is the same worldwide due to biology, causing the same archetypes to appear independently. That's kind of what we were saying earlier.
Right.
And the second explanation is diffusion. He says that myths spread with the concepts that inspired them. So when farming spreads, you're going to have farming gods go with them.
Yeah.
And I think that is probably the more realistic answer. That's closer to what I said. And, there is that definite truth there, and we just find new ways of explaining it. And I think, well, of course, if you're passing along these concepts that change your life, you're going to pass along your beliefs about them as well.
Yeah, you have a more spiritual connection to growing things and harvest and all that stuff, as opposed to the hunter stories about killing something and making a sacrifice and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. I thought, but of course it could be both. He says it could be one or the other, but it could be a little bit of both.
Yeah. I do think that there is a mix there. There's definitely those themes that we are definitely drawn to just sort of innately, but I also think, it is determined a lot by, how these themes spread in our culture and our society as well.
Oh, yeah, sure, for sure.
Then he goes on to say a little bit more about allegory. He says that myths are not just for entertainment. That is just completely out of the question for him, essentially.
Right.
They are associated with deep rituals. He says that great myths explain the rights by which people live in harmony with themselves, each other, and the universe. And that's really the point of myth for him, to explain how we live in harmony.
And that's a good definition. Like we were having a hard time differentiating between myths and like fables and tall tales.
Yeah.
And so he goes into this at this point.
Because he says, because Moyers is like, well, what's the difference between a folk tale? And he says, well, myths, you have certain times that you have to tell these stories, certain rituals associated with them. They have just a deeper
meaning and significance within society. It's a great way to look at the difference between the two.
Yeah. And I like kind of how he explains here. Well, I don't necessarily like it, but I think it's very more explanatory. He says they're always allegorical, even from the time of writing. So he really doesn't believe that there was any sort of, for a lot of these great myths, that there was any sort of, real event that happened. They were people who wanted to tell a metaphor, who wanted to tell an allegory, and they used these images to do so. They didn't even believe themselves that these things actually happened.
Right.
And I don't know if I believe that. I really don't. Because he goes on to say that Jesus' ascension to heaven is a metaphor, and to read it as literal is a mistake. He says that ascension is really just going inward, returning to the source, going like deeper into your soul, and that sort of thing. Which is a very bold take, I think, to say to all of these Christians today, Jesus didn't ascend. It's a metaphor.
I don't think it's a bold take. It's a standard atheist take.
I guess so.
I mean, if you're an atheist, you have to say this.
Yeah.
It's rather garden variety boring. I mean, I don't
it's
see
very
it as revolutionary or, this is terrible. I mean, an atheist has to believe.
Yeah, I guess I didn't mean, revolutionary, but I mean it's very contradictory is what I meant to essentially the entire Christian theology. Yes, it goes against all of Christianity is what I was trying to say.
But he's no longer a Christian.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. He's a LSD taking, he believes in all that kind of stuff. And, and is really into the Eastern religions and Native American philosophy.
Yeah. So why do you think it isn't, an allegory? Why do you think Jesus' ascension is not a metaphor?
It's because they're very close to contemporaneous accounts. I mean, I know the Gospels weren't written that week that it happened.
Yeah.
But when you really delve into it, and he mentions like the false Thomas gospel that was dug up fairly recently, and pieces of it and all that stuff.
He said it was like 30 or 40 years
Prior
before
to
that, which should have been in the 1940s about.
Right. So and I haven't read that, but I've read of it, and it's just it's inconsistent with the other gospels for sure. And so then the question is, well, which one's right and that kind of stuff. The whole thing. But
my big problem with it, and this kind of goes back to what he was saying about all myths being allegorical, is that you do not get. I don't think anyone would follow, in such large numbers, because there was a massive, spread of Christianity
very
after
fast and huge under very difficult circumstances. And the fact of the matter is, Jesus lived.
Yes,
and he was crucified, and he lived in that era. And these stories were circulating immediately at that time. Now, I'm not going to convince anybody that isn't willing to believe it that actually happened, that he rose from the dead. But it really, a lot of it, there is a certain leap of faith that these stories are true, and that he rose from the dead and all that. But it makes so much sense that he died. They go into hiding, and they aren't doing anything to spread the gospel. They're afraid, and they're in hiding.
Yeah.
And then he comes back, and they take off. And I think all but one of them got executed ultimately, or maybe all.
Only one died of old age.
Well, yeah. And for them to be that devoted, especially like the 10th guy, all his buddies are getting killed for their faith. Various ways over this period of time, but they still push forward with it.
Yeah,
there's something more there.
You don't convince people to change their entire way of life around people that hate their way of life by writing a really good metaphor.
Right.
That's what I think.
Correct.
And I think that's my big issue with him saying, even the Old Testament, that was all allegory. Everything is allegorical. They didn't believe any of this was true at the time of writing. I have a big issue with that because I don't think you can convince anybody that these things are true if you don't believe that they're true yourself.
Oh, I don't think that's true.
I don't know if that's true, but I don't think you don't spread it that efficiently and that well. And you don't have it that, I don't know what the word I'm looking for here is.
I think he makes a better argument about Old Testament stories. I think the problem with his theory on Jesus' story is that it's, number one, he existed. So this is not, it's only part of the story of Jesus that it has to be an allegory, because he was there and he was killed. And so then, okay, it's just this part of the story is an allegory. Okay, but a lot of the other circumstantial evidence it indicates something big happened, and it doesn't make sense that these allegories, these stories, start after he died, as opposed to before. Because he's gone, they're in hiding. Then what? His whole movement's gonna die with him.
Yeah.
But I guess his counter argument would be, well, they knew they had to do something because their leader died, and they have to say, well, he rose from the dead. We've seen him.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's kind of garden variety. I'm an atheist, so I'm not going to believe any of that stuff. So I have to have an explanation for it.
Yeah,
this is the only
I think
explanation for it.
I think he goes a little bit more than the standard atheist in that his reasoning behind it is that it is so, because he's done so much reading and research into all of these others. So his reasoning isn't just that I don't believe this and so it can't be true. His reasoning is that I've seen so many similarities in other places that why is this one particularly true? And so I think he goes a little bit more than the standard atheist.
Well, true. He's yeah, I agree.
Yes. He then goes on to talk about the different orders of myth. He says that there are really three centers of mythological creativity, and kind of frames this back in the Middle Ages, but I think there's definitely still some truth in this today.
What page are you on?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
Yes, you're welcome. So he says that the first center is the cathedral, and that's where we see the great myths, these deep allegorical myths. And he says you have the castle, which is the government, the political teachings, which really ought to protect the cathedral, to protect these great myths. He says that third is the cottage, and that is where you have people and folklore, and that's really where your entertainment is. And he says they all operate on the same symbolic field to achieve different purposes. So really, they use all of the same images, but they accomplish very different things. He says, the cathedral is attempting to, these deep allegories, your way of life. the castle or the government is essentially encouraging you to live a certain way, and then the cottage, the home, that's really where the people are to live in harmony and for entertainment purposes. But they all use these same images, across the board, which I think is an interesting take on that, and I think there's a lot of truth there.
Sure.
I think especially when you compare, the government to religion particularly, I think in many ways they are using the same, I don't know if you want to say tactics, but the same methods in a way of getting people to support what they're doing.
True.
In a way.
True. Good points.
Nothing to add on that one?
I don't have to comment on everything.
All right.
I said good points.
All right, thank you.
Do you want me to debate you?
No, that's all right. And I think this next point here is very interesting. You might have a little bit more to say about this, but what he says about priests and shamans, he says that priests today have failed us. They are too stuck in the ethics of good and evil. But shamans or monks are more able to overcome the opposites and find transcendence. He says that religion's great calling is the mystical experience, not social problems and ethics. He says that's why so many people turn to drugs to find that mystical experience in lieu of religion. And I think I'm not sure if I think that is necessarily true, but I think it's a very interesting thought that I hadn't heard before, in that it's not necessarily that religion is all bad, it's just that the way of practicing religion has failed us, which is an interesting take.
Well, he's right in the sense that organized religion, especially Catholicism, deals with ethics and what is right and wrong, and it is not as concerned about those sort of theological mysticism. A monk, like he says, it's true. A monk has a different job than a priest, a parish priest, because a parish priest has to help people through the daily activities of life, and a monk can sit in a room and think about how many angels are in the head of a pin, and both of them are worthwhile, but the whole idea of, well, not the whole, his idea of the value of religion is transcendence. You get to a higher plane or whatever the case may be. And so if that is your focus for religion, and that's how you value religion, of course you're going to have that point of view that he espouses.
Well,
I think if you have my view of religion, which is to assist people in living a more moral life, and being closer to God and the practical day to day, then the priest is doing more than the monk is.
I think he's really missing a big part of religion, surprisingly enough, for a man who studied religion so much. I think it's ever since the creation of religions everywhere, they've all been trying to get people to live a certain way of life.
True.
And I think, he's a big fan of.
But also, religions were part of the government.
Yes,
for most of history.
Yes, that is true. But he's really a big fan, it seems like, of the nature religions, of, just be at one with nature and sort of, the Gaia that we were talking about last time.
Transcendence. He wants to sit in a room and drop a hit of LSD and find out his inner soul and find the inner truth, and then, eat some Doritos or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that's great for him, but that's clearly his focus.
Yeah, because that's really where I disagree with him, because what benefit does that have to the practices of that religion? Because I think religions.
He thinks the true religion and true benefit is to find the inner truth within yourself.
Yes,
because he's
and that's where I disagree with it.
We're all divine creatures. We're all part of God, and we need to find that inner truth.
I mean, if you are looking at it through that framework, of course he would be correct here. But I think he needs to look at it from the different framework of how does religion make people better, essentially, not how they find God.
Yeah, he doesn't think that's the goal of religion. He thinks it's the goal of government.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Yes. Good talk.
Well, it's true.
Yes, that's
and
what I'm saying.
I don't disagree with you, but of course I'm more practical oriented. So my whole falling out with the study of philosophy was, what good does it do?
Yeah.
Give me, carpentry is a lot more beneficial than philosophy.
You do have to have some sort of practical application. You can't just sit and think about things all the time or nothing's going to happen. You can, but it's not going to be very good for the people around you. It's not going to have any clear benefit.
You better have some good insights.
Yes.
It's hard to say that whatever you're going to think of now hasn't been thunk before.
Yeah. True. He then goes on to talk about, how life is full of troubles. And I like this section where he says here, Life is, in its very essence and character, a terrible mystery. This whole business of living by killing and eating. But it is a childish attitude to say no to life with all its pain, to say that this is something that should not have been. Only death is no trouble. People ask me, do you have optimism about the world? And I say, yes, it's great just the way it is. And you are not going to fix it up. Nobody has ever made it any better. It is never going to be any better. This is it, so take it or leave it. You are not going to correct or improve it. And I think, the question that Bill Moyers raises in response to this is a very, just question. He asks, well, won't this lead to passivity? Won't this lead to people not caring about the issues in the world? And what Campbell really says in response, he says, no, you must participate in evil to be alive. Whatever you do is evil for somebody, even if it is good for another.
That is not true.
Yes.
I couldn't disagree with his philosophy in this anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really where I disagree with him, because what he kind of says here is you have to kind of affirm that sometimes you are going to be selfish or greedy or lazy or all of these other essentially vices, because there's no way out of it. That's just how life is, and you have to affirm those things, affirm that they are part of your life in order to sort of transcend life. Right. And we have to live life to its fullest, essentially. And life to its fullest, kind of by his definition, includes the good as well as the bad, in a way.
In his belief of all living things having a certain spiritual value leads him to that argument that because you have to kill to live. Mm-hmm. And I did like his line. I underlined it somewhere in here, saying, to those vegans out there, that's no excuse. You're still killing something to live. Mm-hmm. And I think that's correct to a point. That things that are alive, plants, have to die for you to eat, that salad. Yeah. But I don't consider that a moral bad. There's nothing moral or immoral about it. Mm-hmm. It's just what it is. Yeah. And I think that's part of his problem, is that he equates all life with divinity. Mm-hmm. And so then he has to come to this conclusion that all of us are part of the evil, which is causing death of other living beings in order for us to continue living. But boy, that's such a broad statement. It's no statement at all about morality.
Yeah. It's also kind of a weird path to go down. If you say, well, there's so much evil in life, why not make some more evil, essentially? Or, what is my point in...
I don't know. He's saying there's more. There's just the... Well, it reminds me... the amount of evil that there is, and you're not going to add to it or subtract from it.
He says good and evil is relative to the position you are standing. It reminds me, I saw this thing...
Moral relativism is the definition of it.
Well, moral relativism, but also this law that some philosopher thought recently that was like, the amount of good in the world is always stagnant. It never increases or decreases, because it's essentially like the butterfly effect is what this guy said, is that, when you do something good, you have to do something bad to somebody else. And I disagree with that completely, because there are so many just little good things that do not have any bad repercussions. If I buy ice cream for my brothers, where's the bad that comes from that? I guess you could say, well, I lose my money. Right. But that's not really an evil. It's a lot of assigning very weird values to a lot of mundane actions in order to kind of equal out the good and the bad in the world. And I don't know if necessarily the good is increasing. Yeah. I don't know if it's decreasing, but I don't think it is 100% a law that the good in the world has to stay the same.
It's very similar to the socialist take on the economy, that it's a zero-sum game, that you can't improve it. You just have to divide up who has what. And Margaret Thatcher's great response to that was, well, a rising tide lifts all boats. But even if you have a big boat or a small boat, but she was saying, well, you would rather have the top come down and the bottom come up a little bit so that we're more equal, rather than everybody going up and getting closer but all improving. And there's no logical explanation why we can't all get better. Yeah. If we all work together and we're all kind to each other, the world can improve. And I think if you look at the arc of history, there's still a lot of war, there's still a lot of death, a lot of destruction. But even just capitalism improving the living standards, of course, you'd say, well, maybe that doesn't improve morality, but boy, it does decrease suffering. If you have enough resources, you don't have to make those Hobbesian choices between murdering another human so you can survive. Maybe you can both live. So I think that you can improve things. I don't think there's a zero sum amount of morality in the world. I think and I have to believe that we can all get better. We can all get better.
Yeah.
We can all be better people. And I think if we all worked at it, we would. And for me to, if it's a zero sum, then I can't really improve myself.
Yeah. And that's really where
at the expense of someone else.
That's really where I agree with where Moyers is coming from and asking, wouldn't that lead to everybody being passive? And I don't think Campbell answers that as well as he could, because he says, isn't that the logical conclusion that everybody will be passive? And Campbell says that is not the necessary conclusion to draw. You could say, I will participate in this life, I will join the army, I will go to war, and so forth. I will participate in the game. It is a wonderful, wonderful opera, except that it hurts.
Right.
And I don't think that really answers what Moyers was trying to say. That response almost reminds me of like the Stoic approach to things, in that, there's bad in the world. People will do bad things.
Was it the Stoic or the Cynics?
No, that's the Stoic approach is that, I can't necessarily control what other people do, but I can control my reaction to it.
Oh, true. Yeah.
So that's really what I'm kind of saying there, and that's kind of, I agree with what he says there. I just don't agree with the conclusion that he draws from that. Right, and that, well, there's good and there's evil and it's just relative and blah, 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 blah. Yeah. I think, there is evil in the world, and that's not going to change. I think there always will be evil in the world, but that is not to say that you can't do anything about it. I think you can.
I think evil can multiply if left unchecked, as we've seen throughout history. It's not. If you leave some evil people to their own devices, they're going to create a lot more evil in the world. And I don't just mean bad things. I mean more evil, because you get to retaliatory actions, revenge, and it's a tremendous temptation.
Yeah. He then goes on to talk about affirmation. He says, you must affirm what you deplore in order to affirm the very world, which is our eternity at the moment. He goes into this somewhat confusing, I thought, talk on about what eternity is and how you affirm things. That's kind of what I was saying earlier about how he has to say you have to affirm all these vices, essentially, in order to live a full life, in order to go beyond this life, and that sort of thing. He goes on to explain, what he thinks eternity is. He says, eternity isn't some later time. Eternity isn't even a long time. Eternity has nothing to do with time. Eternity is that dimension of here and now that all thinking in temporal terms cuts off. And if you don't get it here, you won't get it anywhere. The problem with heaven is that you'll be having such a good time there, you won't even think of eternity. You'll just have this unending delight in the beatific vision of God. But the experience of eternity right here and now, in all things, whether thought of as good or as evil, is the function of life. So this is it, and that's it. Which I agree with to an extent, at least in its definition of eternity. I think earlier in that reading, Moyers kind of points out, isn't that very materialistic? Isn't that very focused on this world? And Campbell says, well, yes. And I disagree with him there, in that we should be focusing on just this world. And that's kind of what he's saying, and affirming all of these things. And that's exactly what we were just saying. You don't have to affirm all the bad with the good as well. You can live a life of good and try to keep out as much bad as possible.
Yeah, I was curious with his use of the word affirm, because I think you can acknowledge.
Yeah.
But to affirm,
but it
means like you're consenting or you're approving.
Yeah, because I think that's the difference between what I was saying about the Stoics. The Stoics acknowledge that there is evil in the world, but he says affirm. Right. It's almost like he's saying you have to. Well, I think it is what he's saying, is that you have to take part in some evil, and I think you do not. Yeah. You just do not.
Yeah, we both disagree with that portion of it. He got more into his own personal philosophy in this section, this chapter, than he did the first one, and I think that was a weakness in his explanations of myths as they apply to the inner mind. I mean, that's the journey inward.
The journey inward.
And I think the myths, if he would have, and of course these are all his talks, so he can talk about whatever he wants, but it seems like he was a little bit too personal with his views, as opposed to what myths generally say.
Yeah.
And so our conversation, a lot of what we're talking about in this podcast, was just disagreeing with his personal opinion, as opposed to what myths really inform us about.
Because he's absolutely correct in a lot of the big picture stuff. Because like we were saying last episode, he's super smart and super good at making those connections. But when he gets into the the whys of his philosophies and that sort of thing. I think he really kind of fails there. There's not really much of a reason why for a lot of what he's saying here.
Correct.
It's just, this is what I believe, and that's, like you were saying, that's fine. This is his talk.
Correct.
Right. But I don't think his philosophies really benefit anyone in this situation.
Agreed.
But I guess he would,
you want to become a transcendent.
But I guess he would kind of agree with that. There's no way to really benefit society as a whole. Is kind of what he's saying.
Yeah, and I just find that curious. Just generally, it's like kind of like
especially
why bother?
Especially considering his whole hero's journey, which is essentially the hero changing within himself and going back and improving things around him. I think it's weird for him to kind of cast off all of that improvement side of things and just focus on the journey inward and not focus on how society can be better.
Yeah, because his whole thing is these myths are to inform you about your inner journey, and not anything about society or what you should do for anybody else. It's very self-absorbed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he does mention a few times, it's about living in harmony with others and the universe, but he doesn't really get into how that would happen in his frame of philosophy here.
Right.
Which is strange. It's very strange.
It seems like, if he was at the beginning of Hitler's rise to power, he'd be like, sitting in the one of the halls saying Om while they murdered all the Jews.
Well, he was around in Hitler's rise to power, so I wonder what I would like to ask him if I was Bill Moyers. Well, what do you think of Hitler?
Right.
Do we not do anything about that?
Right.
But I guess he would say, well, no, we would do something about it. It just wouldn't necessarily improve things.
Yeah. Somebody else will take his place, I guess.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yes. Well, that was the end of that chapter, The Journey Inward. Kind of just gave all of our summary thoughts there. But I'm still liking where this is going, even though this chapter didn't have too much big picture insight to me.
It was thought provoking.
It was very thought provoking. Yeah.
Just negative thoughts.
Just very negative thoughts. But yeah, I'm still looking forward to where we go next.
Yes.
The next chapter is on the first storytellers, so I think we'll get more into his opinions on the birth of myth and that sort of thing.
Yeah, back to the main subject.
Yes, back to the main subject. But yeah, it was a very, very interesting discussion between Moyers and Campbell, and I think it will continue to be very interesting going forward in this book.
I agree.
You agree?
I will continue.
You will continue. I'm glad to hear it.
The reading and the
It would be a weird point to stop after almost 80 episodes of us doing this podcast. We've been doing this for a while now.
Yes.
I guess we're coming up on 2 years in November.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Almost unbelievable.
It's been a year and a half. More than that. Well, this has been Unlimited Opinions. You can follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark.
This has been Unlimited Opinions.